Get ready to dive into a story that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from now. Are there similar mysteries in your area? Let's find out together. The year was 1913. The Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky held ancient secrets amid their dense forests and deep valleys. At that time, the region was a patchwork of isolated communities, where entire families lived far apart, connected only by narrow trails that wound between the oak and pine-covered hills. Harlan County, located in the far southeast of the state, was known for its rugged topography and the isolation it imposed on its inhabitants. Roads were poor, winters harsh, and communication with the outside world was slow and irregular. Lydia McAllister was 32 years old when she disappeared. She was a well-known woman in the small community of Cumberland Gap, where she ran a modest boarding house for travelers crossing the mountains toward Tennessee or Virginia. Lydia was described by neighbors as a reserved but cordial person. She had lost her husband 3 years earlier in a mining accident and had since run the establishment alone, receiving mainly merchants, surveyors, and occasionally employees of the coal companies that were beginning to explore the region. Lydia's guest house was located on a property inherited from her family, a 2-story wooden building surrounded by a small apple orchard and a barn where she kept 2 mules and a few chickens. The place was strategically located near one of the main routes through the mountains, which ensured a steady though small flow of guests throughout the year. That autumn of 1913, the leaves on the trees tinged the slopes with gold and orange hues, and the air began to carry the harbinger of approaching winter. It was in mid-October that the first signs of something amiss began to emerge. A draper from Middlesbrough arrived in town reporting that he had tried to stay at Lydia's boarding house 3 days earlier, but found the place completely empty. The doors were locked, the windows closed, and there was no sign of life. He knocked repeatedly, calling her name, but received only silence. He found it strange, as he had sent a letter announcing his arrival, as was customary at the time. The draper continued on to another lodging, but told acquaintances in town about the incident. Other travelers confirmed similar experiences. A surveyor reported passing by the site days earlier and noticing something peculiar. The chickens were roaming freely around the grounds, appearing neglected, and one of the mules was loose in the pasture without the usual care. For those who knew Lydia, this was completely out of character. She was meticulous with her animals and would never leave them without proper supervision. Concern gripped the nearest neighbors, even though close in that area meant living miles away. Sarah Brennan, a woman who lived about 3 miles from the guest house and was somewhat friendly with Lydia, decided to go there accompanied by her brother, Thomas. It was a cold morning in late October when they walked the trail to the property. What they found deeply disturbed them. The house was too quiet, the curtains remained closed, and a strange odor emanated from within. Thomas forced open one of the back windows and entered the kitchen. What he saw inside made his heart race. There were clear signs of disorder, furniture overturned, objects scattered across the floor, and dark stains on some surfaces he chose not to examine closely at the moment. He called for Lydia repeatedly, but received no answer. Sarah, outside, began shouting her friend's name, her voice echoing across the empty mountains. They toured every room in the house. Upstairs, the guest rooms were empty, but one showed clear signs of recent occupancy. An unmade bed, men's belongings on a dresser, and something that caught Thomas's eye, a notebook abandoned on the nightstand. He picked it up and quickly flipped through the pages. There were records of trade routes, lists of goods, and a few names he didn't immediately recognize. Lydia's room, however, was locked from the inside. Thomas had to break down the door, and what he found there made it clear that something terrible had happened. The room was in disarray, clothes strewn across the floor, the wardrobe open with drawers hurriedly pulled out, but Lydia wasn't there. He wasn't anywhere in the house. Sarah and Thomas ran down to the barn. They searched every corner, looked inside barrels, checked the basement where Lydia stored preserves and provisions. Nothing. The woman had simply disappeared, leaving behind her home, her belongings, her animals, and a trail of unanswered questions. Thomas mounted his mule and galloped to Cumberland Gap to alert the county sheriff. Sheriff Daniel Hutchison was a seasoned man with over 20 years of law enforcement experience in this inhospitable region. He quickly assembled a small group of volunteers and headed for Lydia's property. It was early afternoon when they arrived, and the autumnal sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the land. Hutchison was methodical. He began by examining the outside area, looking for footprints, signs of a struggle, any evidence that might indicate what had happened. He found wagon wheel tracks near the main entrance, but that wasn't unusual for a boarding house. What caught his attention was one specific detail. The tracks seemed deeper than usual, as if the wagon had been carrying considerable weight. Inside the house, the sheriff conducted a thorough search. The dark stains Thomas had noticed were examined more closely. Hutchison suspected what they might be, but preferred not to make rash statements. He collected the notebook found in the guest room and a few other objects that appeared to belong to recent visitors. Among them was a broken pocket watch, stopped at 10:45, though it was impossible to determine whether it was morning or evening. As the search continued, other local residents began to gather at the property. Everyone knew Lydia, and everyone was shocked by her disappearance. A neighbor recalled seeing smoke coming from the guest house's chimney about a week earlier, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. Another resident mentioned hearing strange sounds coming from that direction one recent night, but since the mountains often produced confusing echoes, he dismissed them. Sheriff Hutchison knew he needed to act quickly. In this region, evidence could easily disappear, swept away by rain, wind, or wild animals. He organized search teams to scour the surrounding forests, nearby valleys, and trails leading to other communities. Dozens of people volunteered, armed with flashlights and torches, ready to search for Lydia until darkness made it impossible to continue. Meanwhile, Hutchison began asking questions. Who were the last known guests at the boarding house? Had anyone seen strangers around the area in recent weeks? Was there some conflict, some dispute, some reason someone might want to harm Lydia? The answers were vague and inconsistent. Some mentioned seeing unknown men passing through the area, but this was common due to the expanding mining activities. Others spoke of rumors about outsiders involved in shady dealings, but nothing concrete. Night fell over the Appalachian Mountains, and search teams returned without finding any sign of Lydia McAllister. The sheriff posted guards on the property and promised to return at dawn to continue the investigation. As he drove back to Cumberland Gap that cold October night, Daniel Hutchison couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that this case would be unlike anything he'd ever faced. There was something in the shadows of that empty house, something in the silence of those mountains, that whispered terrible secrets waiting to be revealed. Dawn arrived shrouded in a dense fog that enveloped the valleys like a spectral cloak. Sheriff Hutchison returned to Lydia McAllister's property, accompanied by 2 deputies and a local physician, Dr. Edmund Cartwright, whose expertise could be invaluable if they encountered anything disturbing. The grey morning light made everything even more somber, and the silence that hung over the place seemed to carry the weight of something terrible unspoken. The first task of the day was to re-examine the interior of the house with greater attention to detail. Dr. Cartwright, a 58-year-old man with decades of medical practice in this rugged region, carefully analyzed the stains found in various parts of the house. He took small samples and stored them in glass vials, promising to conduct more in-depth tests once he returned to his office in Cumberland Gap. His grave expression spoke louder than his carefully chosen words. Hutchison turned his attention to the notebook found in the guest room. He sat at the kitchen table and began to examine each page with methodical patience. The notes belonged to a merchant, that much was clear. There were lists of goods, farm tools, fabrics, household goods, medicines. But some pages contained something different, names and monetary amounts jotted down in seemingly random order. One name in particular appeared repeatedly, J. Millbrook, $240. Another name appeared less frequently, R. Blackwood, $180. What did these notes mean? Were they debts, payments, illicit dealings? One of the deputies, named Walter Green, was searching the basement when he made a disturbing discovery. Among the barrels of provisions and crates of preserves, he found something hidden under an old tarp, a large, heavy leather suitcase that definitely didn't belong to Lydia. The suitcase was locked, but Green managed to pick the locks with a tool. Inside were men's clothing, some business documents, and a considerable amount of cash in bills and coins, approximately $370, a fortune by the standards of the time. Hutchison was immediately summoned to the basement. He examined the contents of the suitcase with growing apprehension. The documents indicated that they belonged to a man named Joseph Millbrook, an itinerant merchant from Knoxville, Tennessee. There were sales receipts, business correspondence, and a record of stays at various boarding houses throughout the mountains. The last entry in the record was precisely Lydia McAllister's boarding house, dated October 5, 1913. The discovery of the suitcase raised disturbing questions. Why would a guest leave behind his belongings and a significant sum of money? If Millbrook had left voluntarily, he would certainly have taken his luggage. And if he hadn't left voluntarily, what had happened to him? Hutchison felt a chill run down his spine. This case was becoming more complex and sinister by the hour. Searches of the forests continued throughout the day. Groups of volunteers hiked trails, investigated ravines, and searched areas of dense vegetation. Some followed streams flowing down from the mountains, checking riverbanks and natural pools. Others climbed to higher ground, trying to spot any signs of suspicious activity or abandoned structures where someone might be hiding. But the Kentucky Appalachians were vast and unforgiving, thousands of acres of wild forest where a person could vanish without a trace. As the search continued, Hutchison decided to investigate Lydia McAllister's recent life. He spoke with Sarah Brennan, the neighbor who had discovered the property's abandonment. Sarah described Lydia as a strong woman who had overcome the loss of her husband with dignity and determination. She meticulously maintained the boarding house, treated her guests well, and was never involved in any disputes. She had no known enemies, no significant debts, and no apparent reason why anyone would want to harm her. But Sarah mentioned something intriguing. In the last few weeks before her disappearance, Lydia had seemed preoccupied. She had vaguely commented on some guests who had made her uncomfortable, though she hadn't given specific details. Sarah remembered Lydia saying something like, "There are men who carry darkness in their eyes, but at the time she thought it was just a passing impression." Now those words took on a darker meaning. Hutchison also spoke with the local grocer, an elderly gentleman named Herbert Dalton, who knew virtually everyone in the area. Dalton confirmed that Lydia had been in the store about 10 days before her disappearance. She had bought provisions for the boarding house and seemed normal, though a little quieter than usual. Dalton mentioned that 2 strangers had been in the store that same day, buying travel supplies. They were stout, rough-looking men dressed in worn work clothes. One had a visible scar on his face, a mark that ran from his temple to his jaw. The other was taller and wore a wide-brimmed black hat that shaded his eyes. This description made Hutchison wary. He asked if Dalton knew where the men were headed, but the merchant had no information. They had paid in coins, said little, and then departed toward the mountains. Dalton never saw them again. The sheriff carefully jotted down all these details in his investigation notebook, sensing that the pieces of a macabre puzzle were beginning to form, though the full picture remained unclear. On the 3rd day of searching, an alarming discovery was made. A group searching a densely wooded area approximately 2 miles from the guest house found signs of a recent campfire. The site was partially hidden among rocks and old trees, a spot that offered privacy and protection from the wind. Surrounding the campfire were food scraps, empty bottles, and something that prompted the men to immediately call the sheriff: partially burned women's clothing. Hutchison examined the remains with a heavy heart. The clothing was of good quality, consistent with what a woman like Lydia would wear. There were fragments of a dark-colored dress, pieces of a shawl, and the remains of what appeared to be a petticoat. Everything had been thrown into the fire, but the flames did not completely consume the thicker materials. The sheriff carefully collected each fragment, wrapping it in paper for preservation. Sarah Brennan was called to examine the remains, and she tearfully confirmed that she recognized the pattern of the dress's fabric as one Lydia had worn. The atmosphere among the investigators grew even more somber. If those were indeed Lydia's clothes, what had happened to her? Why were her clothes burned in that isolated location? And most importantly, where was she now? The possibilities that arose were all too disturbing to verbalize, but they lingered in the air like uninvited ghosts. Hutchison ordered the search to intensify in that particular area. Every rock was turned over, every bush examined, every depression in the ground investigated. The men worked until darkness forced them to stop, and even then some insisted on continuing with torches and flashlights. The determination to find Lydia, alive or not, drove these simple mountain people to face their fear and exhaustion. Meanwhile, Dr. Cartwright completed his preliminary tests on the samples collected from the house. He called Hutchison into his office and, with a grave expression, confirmed what they both already suspected. The stains were human blood. The amount found in various parts of the house suggested something violent had occurred there. It was impossible to determine with certainty whether they belonged to one or more people, but the distribution indicated a struggle, desperate movement through the rooms. Hutchison knew he needed to expand the investigation beyond the mountains. He sent telegrams to sheriffs in neighboring counties, describing Lydia McAllister and asking if anyone matching her appearance had been seen recently. He also included descriptions of the two strangers mentioned by Herbert Dalton and requested information about Joseph Millbrook, the merchant whose belongings were found in the boarding house's basement. Responses began to arrive in the following days. The sheriff of Bell County to the north responded that there were no records of women matching Lydia's description. The sheriff of Claiborne County, Tennessee, mentioned rumors of merchants being robbed on mountain roads, but nothing confirmed. More intriguing was the response from Knoxville. Joseph Millbrook's family was concerned because he had not returned from his business trip and had not sent any correspondence in nearly 3 weeks, something completely out of character for him. That piece of information connected the pieces even more unsettlingly. Millbrook was also missing. His clothes and money had been found hidden in Lydia's boarding house. What connected these two disappearances? Were they victims of the same terrible fate, or was something more complex happening in the shadows of those mountains? Hutchison called a meeting with his deputies and some respected citizens of the community. They needed to devise a more comprehensive strategy. Local searches had yielded no results, and it was possible that Lydia had been taken far from the area. It was also necessary to investigate the possibility of a criminal organization operating in the mountains, using the isolated guest houses as targets for robberies or worse. The community was shaken. Women who ran similar guest houses began to fear for their lives. Travelers avoided isolated routes. A climate of distrust and fear settled over this region of the Appalachians, where the simple hospitality of mountain people had once prevailed. The shadows seemed darker, the silences more menacing, and every outsider was viewed with suspicion. The weeks that followed brought intense cold to the Appalachian Mountains. November arrived with morning frosts and biting winds descending from the highest peaks, making the search even more challenging. Sheriff Hutchison, however, did not slow down the investigation. Something about the case troubled him deeply, a persistent feeling that the events at Lydia McAllister's boarding house were part of something larger and more sinister. Correspondence with Knoxville authorities yielded valuable information about Joseph Millbrook. The merchant was known as an honest and hard-working man who had been traveling the mountain routes for over 15 years. He had a wife and 2 adult children, as well as a small store in town. His family described a well-established routine. He would leave at the beginning of each month with various goods, visit isolated communities for 3 or 4 weeks, and return with the proceeds from his sales. He always sent letters during his travels, informing them of his whereabouts and when he expected to return. The last letter had been posted from Middlesbrough in early October, mentioning that he was heading to Harlan County and expected to return before the end of the month. Hutchison also received information about other traders working similar routes. 2 of them had reported unsettling experiences in recent weeks. One mentioned being followed by unknown men for part of his journey through the mountains, though nothing concrete had happened. Another reported finding an abandoned wagon on a side trail, showing signs of having been hastily looted. These accounts suggested a disturbing pattern. Someone was targeting itinerant traders, people who carried money and valuable goods and traveled through remote areas where crimes could go undetected for weeks. The theory beginning to form in Hutchison's mind was grim. Lydia, running a boarding house in a strategic location, might have uncovered criminal activity, or worse yet, been forced into some scheme against her will. Perhaps she had witnessed something she shouldn't have, or perhaps she had refused to cooperate with dangerous individuals. The fact that Joseph Millbrook disappeared after staying at the boarding house couldn't be a coincidence. The sheriff decided to delve deeper into the property's recent past. He spoke with other travelers who had stayed there in the previous months. Most had only positive words for Lydia and the accommodations she offered. But a surveyor named Marcus Flynn brought up an interesting memory. He had visited the boarding house in August and noticed something peculiar. During the night, he awoke to the sound of low voices coming from downstairs. He discreetly went downstairs and saw Lydia talking to 2 men in the main room. The conversation seemed tense with abrupt gestures, though Flynn couldn't hear the words. He returned to his room and didn't mention anything the next morning, assuming it was just other guests discussing routes or business. When Hutchison asked Flynn to describe the men, the description partially matched that provided by Herbert Dalton. One of the men was tall and wore a dark hat. The other was stocky. Flynn hadn't noticed the scar mentioned earlier, but the light was dim, and he didn't want to look too long to avoid detection. This information reinforced the possibility that the same individuals had been at the boarding house months before the disappearance, establishing some sort of relationship or arrangement with Lydia. Meanwhile, mountain searches continued intermittently. Smaller groups of volunteers still searched specific areas, particularly ravines and caves that dotted the limestone Appalachian region. Kentucky was famous for its extensive cave systems, and there was the disturbing possibility that evidence might be hidden deep underground. Some local explorers volunteered to investigate known caves within a 5 to 6 mile radius of the guest house. One such expedition, conducted in late November, found something that renewed hope of solving the mystery. In a cave located approximately 4 miles southwest of Lydia's property, explorers discovered signs of recent occupation. There were remains of fires, empty food cans, old blankets, and most significantly, tools and equipment that appeared to have been stolen. Among the items were farm implements, carpentry tools, and unopened boxes of goods, the kind used by traveling traders. Hutchison organized a formal expedition to the cave. The site was difficult to access, requiring a hike through rugged terrain, followed by a steep descent to the entrance. The cave extended tens of meters into the mountain, with several chambers connected by narrow passages. In the main chamber, in addition to the items already mentioned, they found more disturbing evidence. Business documents belonging to several different merchants, not just Joseph Millbrook. There were receipts, correspondence, and even some personal belongings such as watches, pens, and empty wallets. The discovery confirmed a systematic criminal operation in the area. The cave was being used as a hiding place for stolen goods, and possibly as a temporary base for the criminals. The sheriff ordered everything documented and removed as evidence. He posted discreet guards in the area, waiting for the perpetrators to return to their hideout, but days passed without anyone appearing. Among the documents found in the cave, there was one detail that caught Hutchison's attention: a handwritten list of names and dates. The handwriting was rough, likely that of someone with little formal education. The names included merchants, and next to each was a date and location. Joseph Millbrook was on the list, with the notation, "Early October, McAllister Boarding House." There were 6 other names, each with dates spanning the last 8 months. This suggested the crimes had been going on for some time, planned and methodically executed. Hutchison launched an investigation to locate the other merchants mentioned on the list. He sent telegrams to several towns in the region, inquiring about their whereabouts. Responses began to arrive over the following days, each one increasing the gravity of the situation. Of the 6 names, 4 corresponded to men who had disappeared without a trace during business trips in recent months. Their families had reported the disappearances to local authorities, but in an era of poor communication and fragmented jurisdictions, the connections between the cases had never been established. The other 2 names were merchants who had returned from their travels, but both reported strange experiences. One mentioned being approached by armed men on a secluded trail, but managed to escape, abandoning some of his merchandise. The other reported waking up in the night at a boarding house to find his wagon being looted, fleeing before being directly confronted. Both incidents occurred in the same general region of the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky. The evidence pointed to an alarming conclusion. A criminal group operated in the mountains, specifically targeting itinerant traders. They used the isolated guest houses as target identification points, possibly forcing or coercing the owners into cooperation. Lydia McAllister had somehow become part of this scheme, willingly or not. When something went wrong, perhaps a refusal to continue cooperating or an attempt to report the crimes, she paid a terrible price. But that still didn't fully explain what had happened the night she disappeared. The evidence in the house suggested a confrontation, a struggle, something that had gotten out of hand. If Lydia was being forced to collaborate with criminals, what caused the final rupture? Had she been trying to protect Joseph Millbrook? Had she discovered something so serious that she needed to be silenced? Or had the criminals themselves turned against her for some reason? Hutchison knew he needed to find the men described by multiple witnesses, the tall man with the dark hat and the burly man with the scar on his face. They held the key to unraveling the mystery. He distributed detailed descriptions to every sheriff in the region and offered a reward for information leading to the suspect's capture. Posters were posted in markets, post offices, and public squares in dozens of communities throughout the mountains. The public's response was immediate. Several people came forward with information about men matching the descriptions, but most reports led to dead ends. innocent travelers, mine workers, legitimate business owners who merely resembled the suspects in appearance. Hutchison and his deputies followed every lead, but week after week passed without concrete results. Winter deepened over the Appalachians. Snow began to blanket the highest peaks and trails became dangerous. Lydia's boarding house remained empty, a silent structure bearing witness to events that might never be fully understood. Neighbors avoided the property after dark, and rumors began to circulate about strange sounds and unexplained lights seen through the windows. These were mere superstitions born of fear, but they reflected the trauma the incident had caused the community. Lydia's friend, Sarah Brennan, held out hope that she might be found alive. She regularly visited the sheriff's office, inquiring about progress in the investigation. Hutchison always received her patiently, but there was little positive to report. He himself was frustrated by the slow progress of the case, the vastness of the territory to be investigated, and the lack of available resources. In 1913, law enforcement in the Kentucky mountains relied more on personal determination than on technology or advanced scientific methods. Yet Hutchison didn't give up. He continued reviewing evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, exploring new theories. There was something about this case that transcended professional duty. Lydia McAllister had been a hard-working, honest woman who didn't deserve the fate she'd apparently met, and Joseph Millbrook, along with the other missing merchants, had left devastated families waiting for answers. The sheriff felt the weight of that responsibility on his shoulders as the year 1913 drew to a grim close. December brought with it a piercing cold that transformed the Appalachian Mountains into a stark and unforgiving landscape. The bare trees formed black skeletons against the grey sky, and the wind howled through the valleys like an ancient lament. The investigation into Lydia McAllister's disappearance had become Sheriff Hutchison's obsession, consuming his days and invading his nights with nightmares of undiscovered truths. It was during this frigid spell that an unexpected clue emerged from an unlikely source. An itinerant Methodist minister named Reverend Thomas Abernathy sought out Hutchison in his office one foggy afternoon. The Reverend was known in the region for traveling between isolated communities, offering religious services and words of comfort to the mountain dwellers. His reputation was impeccable, and his word was considered trustworthy. Abernathy recounted something that had deeply troubled him for weeks, but which he had hesitated to share for fear of being mistaken. In late September, almost 3 weeks before Lydia's disappearance, he had stayed at her boarding house for 2 nights. During his stay, he noticed something peculiar. On the first night, he woke thirsty and went downstairs to get water. As he passed the main room, he saw a sliver of light coming from the basement. He heard muffled voices, one definitely Lydia's, the others male. The tone of the conversation seemed like negotiation or discussion, though the words were indistinguishable. The Reverend dismissed it at the time, assuming Lydia was dealing with matters related to supplies or repairs to the property. But the next morning, he noticed she looked exhausted and nervous, with dark circles under her eyes and trembling hands as she poured coffee. When he gently asked if everything was okay, Lydia smiled tightly and said she had simply slept poorly. Abernathy tried to offer words of spiritual encouragement, but she quickly changed the subject. What truly motivated the Reverend to seek out the sheriff was a specific memory that surfaced in his recent prayers. On the second morning of his stay, as he was preparing to leave, he saw 2 men arriving at the property on sturdy horses. One was tall and dressed in dark clothing, the other had a stocky build, and when he turned his head, Abernathy clearly saw a prominent scar running down the left side of his face. The men did not enter the house while the Reverend was there, but stood outside talking to Lydia in low tones. Hutchison felt his pulse quicken. The description exactly matched the suspects he was looking for. He asked the Reverend for any other details he could recall. Abernathy mentioned that one of the horses had a distinctive marking, a white spot on its forehead shaped like an irregular star. He also remembered that the tall man had a deep, raspy voice. Even from a distance, his harshness was noticeable. The man with the scar spoke less, gestured more, and there was something in his posture that conveyed a veiled threat. Armed with this renewed information, Hutchison intensified his efforts to locate the 2 men. He sent even more detailed descriptions to authorities in wider regions, including parts of Tennessee, Virginia, and even West Virginia. The description of the horse with the star-shaped white spot was particularly valuable, as horses were registered and traded more frequently than transients. While waiting for answers, the sheriff decided to re-examine the boarding house, this time focusing specifically on the basement where the Reverend had overheard the nighttime conversations. The space was damp and dark, lit only by a small ground-level window. There were shelves of preserved foods, barrels of provisions, crates of vegetables, and the crates where Joseph Milbrook's suitcase had been found. Hutchison swept every inch of the room with a flashlight, looking for anything that might have been missed in the previous searches. It was then that he noticed something curious in a far corner of the basement. The packed earth floor appeared to have been disturbed in one area, though it had since been covered with old crates. He moved the obstacles and examined the soil more closely. There were clear signs that the earth had been recently dug up and replaced. His heart raced. He called his 2 deputies and ordered them to bring shovels. The excavation was meticulous and tense. Every inch of soil removed increased the apprehension of the men present. Hutchison feared what they might find, but knew he had to uncover the truth no matter how disturbing. They dug for about an hour until they reached a depth of about 3 feet. That's when one of the deputies' shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. With extreme care, they removed the surrounding soil and revealed decayed fabric. It was a man's coat, the kind itinerant traders wore to protect themselves from the mountain cold. They continued digging and found more clothing, all men's items in an advanced state of deterioration due to the dampness of the basement. Among the clothing were personal items, a rusty pocket watch, an empty leather wallet, metal buttons, and most significantly business documents in poor condition that, upon careful examination, revealed the partially legible name of one of the missing traders mentioned in the list found in the cave. Hutchison felt a wave of nausea and anger. This discovery confirmed his worst suspicions. Lydia's boarding house had been used as a staging post for innocent victims, but one question remained unanswered. Was Lydia a willing accomplice, or had she herself been a victim, forced into participating under threat? The evidence was ambiguous. The nighttime conversation overheard by the Reverend could be interpreted in several ways: criminal negotiation, Lydia's attempt to extricate herself from a dangerous situation, or even coercion by unscrupulous individuals. The sheriff ordered the entire area to be carefully excavated. They spent 2 full days examining every inch of the basement. They found more belongings buried in different spots, all male, all belonging to travelers. There were at least 3 distinct sets of items, suggesting multiple victims, but they found no human remains, which brought a disturbing relief. Where were the bodies? Had they been taken elsewhere? The extensive caverns in the area offered endless possibilities for permanent concealment. Sarah Brennan was devastated when she learned of the findings. She refused to believe that Lydia could have been complicit in such heinous crimes. She insisted that her friend must have been forced, threatened, and held prisoner in her own home by violent men. Hutchison didn't contradict Sarah directly, but in his heart, he knew the truth was likely more complex and ambiguous than any simple narrative of villains and victims. During this period, a significant response arrived from a Scott County, Tennessee sheriff. A man matching the description of the tall suspect in the dark hat had been seen at a tavern near Huntsville a few weeks earlier. He was accompanied by another man, possibly the one with the scar. Though this witness wasn't certain, the 2 had been drinking heavily, arguing loudly about something related to business in the mountains, and leaving before dawn. The tavern keeper remembered them because they had paid with an unusual amount of silver coins, the kind of payment merchants typically carried. Hutchison took a train to Huntsville, accompanied by a deputy. It was a long and uncomfortable journey through the mountains during the winter, but he was determined. Arriving in town, he spoke extensively with the barkeep and others who had interacted with the suspects. Their descriptions matched perfectly. An additional detail emerged. The men had mentioned plans to head north, possibly to Kentucky's most active mining region, where they could blend in with transient workers and disappear into the crowd. The sheriff spent 3 days in Huntsville and the surrounding area, following cold leads and interviewing anyone who might have information. He visited stables to ask about the horse with the white star marking, but no one recognized the description. He visited boarding houses and inns, providing descriptions of the suspects. Some places reported similar guests, but there were always inconsistencies that made it impossible to confirm identities. Frustrated but not defeated, Hutchison returned to Cumberland Gap in late December. The year 1913 was ending, and with it came the closing of one of the darkest chapters in the recent history of that Appalachian region. Lydia McAllister's boarding house remained empty, its windows boarded up, its garden overrun with weeds. The property had become a symbol of the evil that can lurk even in the most isolated and seemingly peaceful places. On New Year's Eve, Hutchison sat alone in his office reviewing all the case files. He had meticulously documented every discovery, every testimony, every lead he followed. The file had grown to hundreds of pages, but the most crucial element was still missing: the complete truth about what had happened to Lydia McAllister and the missing merchants. He knew these people deserved justice, their families deserved answers, and the community deserved the security of knowing those responsible had been caught. As the local church bells tolled midnight, marking the arrival of 1914, Hutchison made a silent promise. He would not abandon this case. No matter how long it took, how many trails he had to follow, how many doors he had to knock on, he would find the men responsible for these terrible crimes. And he would discover Lydia McAllister's ultimate fate, even if the truth was as dark as the caves that pierced the surrounding mountains. Outside, the snow began to fall again, covering Cumberland Gap with a white blanket that hid the scars and stains of the past year. But beneath that pure, pristine exterior, secrets remained buried, patiently waiting for the moment when they would finally be brought to light. Mountains guard their stories jealously, and the Kentucky Appalachians had many stories yet to tell. The year 1914 arrived, bringing with it a sense of new beginnings for many, but for Sheriff Daniel Hutchison, it was merely the continuation of a search that consumed every waking moment. January brought snowstorms that isolated entire communities for days, making travel through the mountains virtually impossible. During this forced period of inactivity, Hutchison devoted himself to analyzing every scrap of information gathered over the past few months, searching for connections that might have been overlooked amid the urgency of the initial investigation. One such connection emerged unexpectedly when comparing Lydia's guest records. She kept a simple notebook where she wrote down guests' names, arrival and departure dates, and rates charged. The notebook had been found in the house, and Hutchison had examined it previously, but this time he decided to systematically cross-reference the information with other documents. What he discovered was revealing. In the 8 months before Lydia's disappearance, the two suspects had stayed at the guest house at least 5 times, always for short periods of 2 or 3 days. Even more intriguing was the temporal pattern. Each visit by the suspects was followed within a week or two by the disappearance of a merchant who had also passed through the boarding house at the same time or shortly thereafter. Joseph Millbrook was just the latest in a series. There was Samuel Porter, who disappeared in April. There was William Gentry, who never returned from his trip in June. There was Thomas Wickham, whose belongings were found buried in the boarding house's basement. Each of them had crossed paths with the two mysterious men at that particular point in the Appalachian landscape. Hutchison began to reconstruct what he believed to be the criminals' method of operation. They used Lydia's boarding house as a lookout post, identifying promising targets among passing travelers. Itinerant traders were ideal. They carried cash and valuable goods, followed predictable routes through isolated areas, and their prolonged absences didn't raise immediate alarms. The criminals waited for their victims to leave the boarding house, then followed them along deserted mountain trails, where they could act without witnesses. But Lydia's role in this scheme remained ambiguous and disturbing. Evidence suggested she provided information about the guests, perhaps details about planned routes, valuables, or departure times. But had she done so voluntarily, motivated by greed, or had she been coerced through threats, fear, or some form of manipulation? The fact that she herself had disappeared suggested that, at some point, her relationship with the criminals had fatally deteriorated. As February arrived and the weather began to ease, Hutchison received information that renewed his hope. A Knox County cattle dealer reported overhearing conversations in a tavern about 2 men who had been seen near Pineville, a town approximately 30 miles north of Cumberland Gap. The men matched their descriptions and had aroused suspicion by paying for lodging and meals with a strange mixture of old coins and crumpled bills. The sheriff immediately organized an expedition. He took 3 well-armed deputies with him and headed for Pineville. The journey took 2 days over poor roads still partially covered in snow. Upon arrival, Hutchison sought out the local sheriff, a man named Clayton Mercer, and explained the situation. Mercer was familiar with his jurisdiction and confirmed that 2 strangers matching their descriptions had been in the area recently, but had already left about a week ago. Mercer provided valuable information. The men had rented a room in a modest boarding house on the outskirts of town. The owner, an elderly widow named Martha Hendricks, described them as quiet, rough-hewn individuals who kept to themselves and only came out after dark. They stayed for 5 nights and left abruptly one morning without warning, leaving their payment on the room table. Hutchison and Mercer visited the boarding house and spoke at length with Martha Hendricks. The woman was visibly nervous as she recalled the guests. She said there was something deeply unsettling about them, an aura of danger that made her stay away. She had heard snatches of conversation through the thin walls, words about cargoes, routes, and profit-sharing. On one occasion, she saw through the window that they possessed firearms, revolvers kept in holsters under their coats. The room where the men were staying was thoroughly searched. Although it had been cleaned after their departure, Hutchison searched for any forgotten items that might provide clues. Under the mattress of one of the beds, he found a torn piece of paper with notes on it. The handwriting was rough but legible. Barbourville, February 15th, tool shipment. It was only a fragment, but it suggested the criminals were planning another hit in Barbourville, a town further north, and the date was 3 days away. Hutchison made a snap decision. He and his men would head to Barbourville immediately and attempt to intercept the suspects. It was a risky gamble based on fragmentary information, but it was the best opportunity they'd had in months. He thanked Sheriff Mercer for his cooperation and left that afternoon. The journey to Barbourville was arduous. The roads improved somewhat as they descended into less mountainous terrain, but the weather remained unpredictable, with sudden gusts of freezing wind and intermittent rain. They arrived in town on the afternoon of February 14th, a day before the date mentioned in the note. Hutchison located the local sheriff, explained the situation, and requested assistance. Together, they devised a plan to stake out the main routes into and out of town, searching for men matching the descriptions. Barbourville was considerably larger than Cumberland Gap, with a population of approximately 3,000. There were numerous boarding houses, taverns, and commercial establishments, making surveillance challenging. Hutchison divided his men into teams, each responsible for monitoring specific areas. He himself positioned himself near the town's main warehouse, where merchants often loaded goods before setting out on their journeys. February 15th dawned cold and cloudy. Hutchison and his men held their positions since the early hours of the morning. The city's activity was normal. Merchants preparing cargo, residents going about their daily activities, nothing to suggest trouble. The hours passed slowly, and tension began to give way to frustration. Perhaps the information on the note was incorrect, or perhaps the criminals had changed their plans. It was mid-afternoon when one of the deputies came running to Hutchison. 2 men matching the descriptions had been seen in a tavern near the river. They were drinking and talking with a merchant who was preparing a load of farm tools for a wagon outside. The deputy had recognized one of the men's horses. It had an irregularly shaped white spot on its forehead, exactly as described. Hutchison's heart raced. Finally, after months of searching, he was close to confronting the men he believed responsible for terrible crimes. He quickly gathered his men and the local sheriff, a total of 6 armed men. They approached the tavern cautiously, positioning men at the exits to prevent escape. Hutchison entered through the main door, accompanied by 2 deputies. The tavern's interior was dark and smoky, with about 10 people scattered among worn wooden tables. At the back of the establishment, next to the bar, stood 2 men who immediately matched the descriptions Hutchison had memorized. One was tall and wore a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. The other was shorter and stockier, and when he turned his face, the scar running down his left side was unmistakable. The sheriff took a deep breath and stepped forward. The other tavern patrons sensed the tension and began to back away silently. Hutchison stopped about 10 feet from the suspects and spoke firmly. "Gentlemen, I am Sheriff Daniel Hutchison of Harlan County. I need you to come with me to answer some questions about the events that occurred at Cumberland Gap." The 2 men stared at each other. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, in a sudden movement, the scarred man pushed the table toward Hutchison and ran for the back door. The tall man drew a revolver, but before he could aim it, one of the deputies knocked him down with a well-aimed blow. The sound of the struggle echoed through the tavern, chairs breaking, bottles falling, and cries of alarm from the others present. Hutchison chased the scarred man out the back door, emerging into a narrow alley. The fugitive ran with surprising agility, leaping over crates and debris. But Hutchison was younger and driven by months of pent-up frustration. He quickly gained ground, and when the fugitive tried to scale a fence, Hutchison grabbed him by the legs and pulled him down. The ensuing struggle was brief, but intense. The man put up a violent fight, throwing punches and kicks, But Hutchison managed to subdue him with the help of a deputy who had rushed in. They handcuffed the suspect and dragged him back to the tavern, where the tall man was already restrained and handcuffed. Both prisoners were breathing heavily, looks of hatred and defiance on their faces. Hutchison felt a wave of relief and satisfaction. After so much time, so many trails traveled, so many sleepless nights, he finally had in custody the men he believed responsible for the disappearances and crimes that haunted the Appalachian Mountains. But capturing them was only the beginning. Now came the hard part, getting them to talk, extracting confessions, uncovering the full truth about what happened to Lydia McAllister and the other victims. The prisoners were taken to Barbourville jail and placed in separate cells. Hutchison ordered them to be thoroughly searched. Among the tall man's belongings, they found a wallet containing $230 in assorted bills, some business documents that clearly didn't belong to him, and a pocket watch engraved with the initials J.M., Joseph Millbrook. The man with the scar carried less cash, but in his pocket was a simple, delicate women's gold ring, the kind a woman like Lydia might wear. The capture of the two suspects in Barbourville sent waves of relief and anticipation throughout the communities affected by the mountain crimes. News traveled slowly back then, but when it arrived, it spread quickly by word of mouth. Families of missing merchants began sending letters and telegrams to Sheriff Hutchison, begging for information, hoping to finally get answers that would bring some closure to their devastating losses. The two prisoners were held in separate cells in Barbourville for 3 days, while Hutchison prepared for transport back to Cumberland Gap, where they would face formal charges. During this time, the sheriff repeatedly attempted to question the men, but both remained stubbornly silent. The tall man, who finally identified himself as Silas Drummond, simply stared at Hutchison with cold, blank eyes, refusing to answer any questions about his activities or the items found in his possession. The scarred man, whose name was Caleb Ruther, alternated between complete silence and outbursts of incoherent rage, but never provided any useful information. Hutchison's frustration grew with each fruitless interrogation. He had circumstantial evidence, the victims' belongings found with the prisoners, testimonies placing them in the vicinity of the crimes, the established pattern of stays at Lydia's boarding house, followed by disappearances. But without confessions or direct evidence linking them to the specific crimes, building a solid legal case would be challenging, and most importantly, without their cooperation, discovering what really happened to Lydia McAllister and the whereabouts of the missing merchant's remains would remain a torturous mystery. On the 4th day, Hutchison received unexpected assistance. A Knoxville attorney named Harrison Caldwell arrived in Barbourville, representing Joseph Millbrook's family. Caldwell was a meticulous and determined man, known for his skill in complex criminal cases. He reviewed all the evidence collected and proposed a strategy: offer one of the prisoners the possibility of a reduced sentence in exchange for full testimony against the other and disclosure of the locations where the victims might be found. It was a risky tactic that relied on creating division among the inmates, but Hutchison agreed to try. Caldwell suggested approaching Caleb Ruther first, as his emotional instability suggested he might be more susceptible to psychological pressure. They waited until late at night, when the jail was quiet and the long shadows created an oppressive atmosphere. Hutchison and Caldwell entered Ruther's cell, accompanied only by a lamp that cast a dim, flickering light. Caldwell began speaking calmly but firmly. He explained to Ruther the gravity of the charges he faced: multiple murders, grand theft, crimes that would certainly result in hanging if found guilty. The word hanging made Ruther visibly flinch. Caldwell continued, describing in detail the legal process that would follow, the testimony that would be presented, the evidence that had already been documented. Then he offered the alternative: full cooperation in exchange for a recommendation of clemency, possibly life imprisonment instead of execution. Ruther remained silent for long minutes, his eyes darting nervously between Hutchison and Caldwell. Finally, his voice hoarse and hesitant, he began to speak. He admitted that he and Silas Drummond had been involved in robberies of merchants over the past 2 years, operating primarily in the mountains of Kentucky and Tennessee. He confirmed that they used isolated boarding houses as observation points, identifying potential targets among travelers. But he insisted that the crimes had never been planned to involve lethal violence, that things had gotten out of hand on several occasions. Hutchison pressed for specific details about Lydia McAllister. Ruther hesitated again, clearly struggling internally with how much to reveal. He finally admitted that Lydia had been coerced into providing information about guests. She had no choice, he insisted. Drummond had threatened her months earlier, saying he would burn down her property and make it look like an accident if she didn't cooperate. Lydia was alone, vulnerable, and too afraid to seek help from the authorities. She provided basic information about merchants who appeared to be carrying valuable goods, but she always believed the robberies would occur non-violently, far from her property. As for Joseph Millbrook, Ruther related a dark story. Millbrook had checked into the boarding house in early October as planned. Drummond and Ruther intended to follow him when he left and carry out a simple robbery on a secluded trail. But the night before Millbrook's scheduled departure, something unexpected happened. Lydia had a crisis of conscience. She confessed to Millbrook about the criminal scheme, imploring him to contact the authorities at Cumberland Gap as soon as he arrived in town. Millbrook was shocked but grateful for the warning and promised Lydia he would guarantee her protection. Unfortunately, the conversation was partially overheard by Drummond, who had arrived at the property earlier than expected that night. He was furious upon discovering Lydia's betrayal. Ruther arrived shortly after and found Drummond violently confronting Lydia and Millbrook in the main room of the house. The situation escalated quickly. Millbrook tried to defend Lydia, but a physical fight ensued. Furniture was overturned and objects were broken. Drummond was stronger and more brutal. The confrontation ended tragically for both. Ruther stopped speaking at this point, his breathing heavy, sweat pouring down his face despite the chill of the cell. Hutchison felt a growing nausea, but forced himself to maintain professional composure. He pressed Ruther to continue, to reveal the final details, even if they were disturbing. The prisoner shook his head, clearly tormented by the memories. He said only that Drummond had solved the problem permanently, that he himself had only helped clean up the evidence, because he was too terrified to refuse. When asked about the locations where the victims might be found, Ruther provided specific information. He said there was a deep cave approximately 8 miles west of Lydia's boarding house, in a seldom visited area of dense forest. The cave had a narrow entrance hidden by vegetation, but extended tens of meters downward, forming a natural chasm. It was there that evidence had been discarded over the months. Ruther drew a crude map on a piece of paper, marking geographical landmarks that could help pinpoint the exact location. Hutchison felt conflicting emotions. He had finally obtained the confession he sought, but the truth was as dark as he had feared. Lydia McAllister had not been a willing accomplice, but a victim of coercion who had tried to do the right thing in the end, paying the ultimate price for her attempt at redemption. Joseph Millbrook had died trying to protect an innocent woman. The other missing merchants had been victims of a calculated scheme operated by men without scruples or compassion. The next morning, Hutchison organized an expedition to the cave described by Ruther. He took 5 men with him, including Attorney Caldwell, whom he insisted on accompanying equipped with ropes, flashlights, and climbing gear. The journey to the indicated area took several hours through rugged terrain. Ruther had provided good directions, and they were able to locate the cave relatively quickly, although its entrance was indeed well hidden by dense brush and rocks. The descent into the cave was perilous and claustrophobic. The limestone walls were damp and slippery, and the air grew increasingly cold and thin the deeper they descended. After descending about 20 meters, they reached a larger chamber where the floor leveled off somewhat. There, in the dim light of their flashlights, they found what they were looking for and yet feared they would find. There were remains of at least 4 individuals in varying stages of decomposition, depending on how long they had been there. There were also piles of clothing, personal belongings, and business documents, all carelessly dumped in that unlikely tomb. The scene was deeply disturbing, a silent testament to lives violently cut short, dreams shattered, families left without answers for months. Hutchison and his men worked methodically and respectfully. They carefully documented everything, drew diagrams of the scene, and collected evidence that might help identify the victims. The process took hours and was emotionally draining for everyone involved. When they finally ascended to the surface, carrying the remains in canvas bags, the sun was setting, dyeing the sky orange in stark contrast to the darkness of what they had witnessed in the depths. Back at Cumberland Gap, the difficult process of identifying the victims and notifying their families began. Dr. Cartwright examined the remains with the assistance of a medical examiner from Lexington. Through clothing, personal items, and preserved physical characteristics, They were able to definitively identify Joseph Millbrook. They also identified Thomas Wickham and Samuel Porter, two of the missing merchants. One set of remains was consistent with the size and build of a woman, and among the nearby belongings was the simple gold ring that had been found in Caleb Ruther's pocket. It was Lydia McAllister. Sarah Brennan was personally informed by Hutchison. She wept bitterly, but there was also a sense of relief in finally knowing the truth, in finally being able to make proper funeral arrangements and begin the grieving process. The entire community attended Lydia's funeral, held on a grey March afternoon. Reverend Abernathy led the service, speaking of forgiveness, of the price of trying to do what is right even when terrified, of the courage Lydia demonstrated in her final moments. The merchants' funerals were held in their hometowns, with Hutchison attending each to pay his respects and provide the families with the details they had long sought. These were painful but necessary moments, bringing closure, even if tainted by profound sadness. As for Silas Drummond and Caleb Ruther, they were formally charged with multiple murders, robbery, and other crimes. Their trial was scheduled for May 1914 in the Harlan County seat. Drummond remained silent and defiant until the end, refusing to show any remorse or cooperation. Ruther, in turn, provided detailed testimony during the trial, confirming everything he had confessed to Hutchison and providing additional evidence that solidified the case against Drummond as the primary architect and perpetrator of the crimes. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts for both defendants on all counts. Drummond was sentenced to death by hanging. Ruther received life imprisonment with hard labor in recognition of his cooperation with authorities. Drummond's sentence was carried out in July of that year on a humid, overcast morning, witnessed by dozens of people who traveled from surrounding communities to see justice being served. The months following Silas Drummond's execution brought a gradual transformation to Kentucky's Appalachian communities. The sense of dread that had hovered over mountain roads and isolated guest houses slowly began to dissipate, replaced by cautious vigilance and a renewed sense of solidarity among neighbors. People returned to travel with greater confidence, though always carrying with them the dark lessons of that troubling period. Lydia McAllister's property remained abandoned for some time. No one wanted to live in a place marked by such tragic events, where the walls seemed to hold echoes of violence and despair. Sarah Brennan eventually took charge of the land, honoring her friend's memory by maintaining the small family cemetery where Lydia was finally laid to rest. The orchard's apple trees continued to blossom each spring, oblivious to the human tragedies that had occurred beneath their shadow, offering their fruit to the birds and the wind. Sheriff Daniel Hutchison gained considerable recognition for his tireless determination to solve the case. Newspapers in Lexington and even Louisville published articles about the investigation, describing it as an example of exemplary dedication to justice, even in the face of limited resources and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Hutchison, however, was never completely satisfied with the outcome. He knew he had arrived too late to save Lydia and the other victims. He carried the weight of unanswered questions. Could he have acted faster? Were there signs he overlooked? Could Lydia have been protected if authorities had paid attention to the patterns of disappearances sooner? These questions haunted him for years, shaping his approach to police work for the rest of his career. He became a vocal advocate for greater cooperation between jurisdictions, arguing that crimes that crossed county lines required coordination that simply didn't exist at the time. He wrote letters to state officials proposing more efficient communication systems between sheriffs, centralized crime records, and standardized training for investigators. Many of his ideas were considered too radical or impractical for the time, but they planted seeds that would eventually blossom into future reforms. Caleb Ruther served his sentence at the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Frankfort. According to accounts from prison guards and chaplains, he became progressively more tormented as the years passed. He spoke frequently of nightmares, of visions of faces silently accusing him. In 1921, 7 years after his imprisonment, Ruther was found dead in his cell. The circumstances were never fully clarified, but it was officially recorded as a death from natural causes related to heart problems. Some who knew him suspected that the weight of guilt eventually consumed not only his mind but also his body. The victims' families moved on as best they could, bearing invisible but lasting scars. Joseph Millbrook's family eventually sold their Knoxville store and moved west, seeking a fresh start away from the painful memories. Thomas Wickham's widow never fully recovered from her loss, living her final years in melancholic silence. Samuel Porter's children grew up without a father, but kept his memory alive through stories of his kindness and honest work. The boarding house that had belonged to Lydia McAllister was finally demolished in 1918. Time and the elements had taken their toll on the wooden structure, but more than that, no one wanted to preserve a monument to such horrors. The land was returned to the forest, allowing nature to slowly reclaim what humans had built and tarnished. Today, if one knew where to look among the trees and shrubs that dominate the area, one could still find traces of stone foundations, pieces of brick from the fireplace, and fragments of glass from windows broken over a century ago. The cave where the remains were found became an object of morbid curiosity for some time. Local explorers occasionally visited the site, but there was something deeply unsettling about the atmosphere. The entrance was eventually sealed with rocks and earth by order of authorities, both to prevent accidents and to give final peace to this unlikely tomb. The surrounding trees grew tall and dense, hiding the site from casual glances, allowing the Appalachians to keep yet another of their many dark secrets. The years transformed Lydia McAllister's case into a local story, told and retold around fireplaces on cold winter nights. Details were exaggerated over time. Supernatural elements were added by creative storytellers, but the core truth remained. A lone woman trying to survive in hard times was coerced into participating in terrible crimes, and when she finally found the courage to resist, she paid the ultimate price. It was a story about vulnerability, about how evil can flourish in isolated places where the law struggles to reach, about the price of trying to do what's right, even when terrified. Reverend Thomas Abernathy, whose information had been crucial to the investigation, continued his itinerant ministry in the mountains for another 2 decades. He frequently preached on themes of moral courage and the importance of speaking out against injustice, even when it would be easier to remain silent. Although he never mentioned Lydia's case directly in his sermons, those who knew him well understood the source of his passion on these topics. He carried the burden of having seen signs of trouble, but not acted immediately, a silent guilt that shaped the rest of his pastoral work. Herbert Dalton, the elderly merchant who provided descriptions of the suspects, lived to be 83. In his later years, he would often sit in front of his store and tell stories about the old days in the mountains. Lydia's case was one of his favorite stories, though he always told it with a somber and reflective tone. He emphasized to the young listeners the importance of paying attention to details, of trusting their instincts when something seemed wrong, of never assuming that small communities were automatically safe simply because they were isolated. Sarah Brennan never married, dedicating her life to preserving her friend's memory and caring for the land where Lydia was buried. She planted wildflowers on the grave each spring, ensured the headstone remained legible and well-maintained, and visited regularly to speak with Lydia as if she were still present. Sarah died in 1937 at the age of 71 and was buried next to her friend, as she had requested. The 2 women who shared life and tragedy in the Kentucky mountains finally rested together in peace. Dr. Edmund Cartwright continued his medical practice into old age, treating generations of families in the mountain communities. Lydia's case remained the most disturbing of his career, and he occasionally reflected on the limitations of medicine and forensic science of his time. His personal records, preserved by his family, contain detailed notes on the case, including observations on how evidence could have been better collected and analyzed with more advanced techniques. His notes eventually contributed to improvements in medical investigation procedures in the region. The Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky remained a place of stark beauty and hidden mysteries. Other dark stories would emerge over the decades. Other tragedies would mark other communities. But Lydia McAllister's case remained one of the most disturbing in the region's collective memory. It was a reminder that darkness can lurk in the most unlikely places, that ordinary people can be thrust into extraordinary situations, and that courage sometimes means simply trying to do what is right, even knowing the price can be fatal. Today, more than a century later, the case files still exist in the Harlan County Historical Records. Yellowed pages document every detail of the investigation, every testimony, every piece of evidence collected. Historians occasionally pore over these documents, fascinated by the window they offer into a different period in American history, when justice depended more on individual determination than technology, when crimes could remain hidden for months in the isolated wilderness of the mountains. Lydia McAllister's story reminds us that behind every historical mystery are real people who suffered, who were afraid, who made difficult choices under impossible circumstances. She reminds us that justice, even when finally achieved, often comes too late for those who needed protection most. And she reminds us that mountains guard their secrets jealously, revealing them only to those persistent and courageous enough to seek the truth even when it is too dark to comfortably contemplate. The winds still blow through the valleys of Kentucky, whispering among the ancient trees that witnessed events long forgotten by most. The seasons continue their eternal cycle, indifferent to the human tragedies that occasionally mar the stark beauty of that landscape. And somewhere among the forested mountains, where once stood a modest boarding house run by a woman who tried to do the right thing, nature has completely reclaimed its territory, erasing the last physical traces of a history that now lives only in yellowed documents and memories passed down through generations. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you reflect on courage, justice, or the dark mysteries that inhabit our collective past, consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more disturbing stories waiting to be told, other mysteries from the mountains and plains of America that deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us what you thought of this investigation and if there is a specific historical case you would like us to explore. Your input helps keep these important stories alive, ensuring that the lessons of the past are not forgotten until the next journey through the shadows of history.